Okay, so guys, can you see my screen?
Yes, Jackie, we can see it.
Okay. Okay, so guys, welcome everyone. So in today's session we will going to discuss about, like, it's more and more like theoretical session. Like, also we will show some how to write good ramls and all those things. So in this session we will talk about API and raml best design best practices and the guidelines. Okay, so organization, Jitendra, basically, like, I will give some introduction about me. I am a MuleSoft ambassador, and currently I am leading a Surat and Nasik MuleSoft Meetup group, having overall 13 plus years of experience in the integration and APIs. And currently I am certified MuleSoft integration architect. I have experience of working on some various digital transformation and like migration, defining the migration strategy projects basically. Yeah, that is all about me. Then Nitish is not available for today's session. So I want, Tirthankar, like, you can take it from here. Basically, first you can introduce yourself. So before that, what agenda will we will be having. The first thing, like, we will discuss about, what are the best practices for API, for writing the APIs. Or like later we will see what are the best practices for writing the REST API modeling language, that is the RAML. Okay, so I want, like, Tirthankar, you can take it from here, so you can share your own screen and, yeah.
Sure, sure, Jackie. Let me share. Do you need to stop sharing before I can share? I am not able to. Yeah, yeah, okay, sure. I can share it now. Okay, is it visible? Uh,
Yes,
guys?
yes, we can see the screen.
Okay, okay, great. All right, so hi all, this is Tirthankar, and I have been working in MuleSoft for quite some time now. So mostly into the insurance domain, having 3+ years of experience, and proficient in both front end and back end technologies. I have been working on multiple technologies, and I also got the second runner-up position in the MuleSoft hackathon that was organized in the 2020s. From certification point of view, I am MCT level 1 and MCIA certified, and planning to give my MCPS soon. So that's it from the certifications. So from the agenda perspective, this is what we'll cover. REST API design best practices. So this will be covered by me, and then the RAML design best practices, which will be covered by Jackie, followed by which we'll have this trivia quiz, some networking, and then finally the wrap up. Okay, so let's dive into the REST API best practices. So before going into the best practices, let's first understand what is an API, right? So an API is a set of definitions and protocols for building and integrating application software. So it's like something that is used by the information provider and the information user. So let's take an example that you are an information user and you have created some application, or maybe you are even using Postman, right? So that becomes an information user, and the provider might be a weather API, right? So it is something which is providing us the weather related details. So API is like a contract between these two. So it is used by the information user to connect with the information provider to fetch the appropriate details that they need. And it can be also referred to as a contract. So it is a contract between the two parties. So if you want to interact with any system, right, whether it is a computer system to retrieve information or perform an action or a function, an API helps to communicate with them. So like I am communicating with you over the online channel and using English as a language. So you can consider API as that language for the systems. So the systems are communicating using APIs. Now it is not just for it's not just for the information provider and the information user in the sense that it has to be a human, but it can also be a non-human entity. Like for example, even within the system and the process layers, right, which we are knowing from the API connectivity. So even they are communicating using the API layers or HTTP layers. So that is what an API is. What makes an API REST? So REST is a set of architectural constraint. It is not a protocol or standard. So it is an architectural constraint which is added onto the API which makes it REST. For an API to be considered RESTful, it must conform to certain criteria which I have noted here. So firstly, it should be having a client-server architecture, which is made up of like client-server resources, and usually it is managed over an HTTP layer, right? So you are using an HTTP protocol to communicate. It must be stateless. So what do you mean by stateless? Like let's say I'm calling some API, let's say users, right? It shouldn't be dependent on the previous call that I make to that API. It should be stateless. So it shouldn't depend on the state of the previous calls, or it needs to be saved or something like that. So all the data that is needed for that API to function, it is provided at every API call, and then it should have a uniform interface between the components so that the information is transferred in a standard form. So standardization is really important because it makes life easy not just for the information provider but also for the information user, right? So that is why a uniform interface definitely helps. So these are the principles which makes a API REST API. Now what about the verbs and methods? So here are some list of verbs and methods that are available, and let's just go through them. So we have a get method which is often used, and it is like it is able to return all the objects or the current value of an object. Next we have a put API. So it is used for an update or creation of an resource. So let's say that you fire a put API and the resource is already there, then it will update it, and if it is not there, then it will create an object. So that's what put does. So it often acts as a patch or a post. Next is a delete. So it is used for deleting an object. So it is quite mnemonic enough. Next is post. So it is used to create an object in the data store. So let's say I want to create an employee in my employees table. So I'll fire a post API call and it will create that employee with whatever details I pass it to. Next is the head. So it is often used to return the metadata of an object, and you know whichever API supports get, it is often supporting the head method as well. Next is the patch. So patch and put, how does it differ? So patch is like you only update a partial update. Like let's say I have an employees table where I have employee name, employee age, and some other attributes as well. Now I just want to update, let's say, the age of that employee. So I will just pass that particular age. That's it. In the JSON body, I will pass age is equals to whatever value or colon whatever value, and that should update only that part. Input, you are updating or you are sending the whole resource object. So it should contain the name, the age, and whatever details are there. So that's how it differs from put and patch. So it is a partial update and it is a full update. Now, as I mentioned earlier, if the resource is not present, then it will create that resource. Now, what about options? So often you will see that nowadays the trend is like people use front-end technologies like Angular and React and stuff like that, and often it can be hosted on two separate domains. Like let's say our APIs are hosted in the CloudHub domain, cloudhub.io, and your front end, which is like user facing, it is hosted on your own domain. Let's say some xyz.com. So if I have to make a call between this interdomain, so this is what is comes down to CORS or cross origin resource sharing. So the option verb is often used as a pre-flight request before the before the actual request to check the cross-domain capability, like whether it is able to serve the request or not. Because often you will see that not all APIs are enabled with CORS. In the API manager itself, you have a provision of adding the CORS into your API, so your implementation can remain as it is, but from the API manager perspective, you can add the cost policy on the fly. So these options call are very useful. Yeah, it's a pre-flight request for checking the capability of cross-domain or cross-origin request from the server point of view. Now all of them are this is an idempotent one, get, because it doesn't changes with whatever number of calls you make. Put doesn't do, delete doesn't. However, post and patch are often not idempotent. The reason being, so let's say you patch some, you do a patch call. Let's say I updated the name is equals to John, and then I updated the name is equals to, let's say, Martha. So both the calls will change the actual resource down the line, right? So it is not idempotent. So every call will actually give you the same result. It doesn't mean so, because multiple people can call the same API at different instance of time or at the same instance of time, and the object state might change very frequently. So it's not idempotent. So coming to the principles point of view, so we have the first principle out here, which is like the naming convention. It should be nouns and not verbs, like slash employees and not slash create employees. So it shouldn't contain the verb out here, because that is kind of handled by the rest verbs like put, patch. I'll come to that, but for this one, we should always be using the nouns out here. The noun for this particular API is employees. So similar such examples are get invoices or all invoices. Invoices. This is the noun. So you are creating an invoice. Invoices is the noun. You are getting a particular invoice. Again, invoices is the noun here. Deleting invoices. Again, this particular invoices is the noun. So you should always have noun and not verbs. So it shouldn't be like get invoices or create invoices, get invoices by ID or something like that. So you should have a particular noun that should be part of the URI, and then let the HTTP verbs take care of the actions. Next is you should always use plural nouns. Now it is not a hard and fast rule that you have to follow this, but it is usually better to do in the sense that you can always pass the order ID. You can always pass the order ID to fetch a particular order. Like let's say I'm getting all the orders, so orders being plural. So you are using the plural form here, and then I want to get a particular resource or a particular order. So I pass the order ID in the URI param. So that returns me a single resource. So using plural, you can always fetch you can always fetch the singular resource as well. That is always possible. But it is always it is recommended in the sense that you can always use or try to do the plural form of it, because it opens a lot of new possibilities that you can do in your integration plan. Like over here, right? So you can use get order a particular order, delete, you can delete a particular order. So orders and then the order ID takes care of the singular resource out here. Now I already said that the verb shouldn't be applied into the or onto that particular endpoint, like create employee or create employees. This shouldn't be the case. You should always use employees, and the create or the functionality should be handled by this HTTP verbs. So let's look at some examples here. Again, going back to the invoices example. So get means read, right? So get is the HTTP verb which says that the action is read. So it will read the data store and it will return a list of invoices. Then you have post, which is like create a resource. So you can create a new invoice in the data store. Then you can use put, which will update the resource, or create if it is not there. And then finally you have delete, which will delete the invoices. Now, since I have used invoices, which is plural, I can pass the invoice ID to do the operation for a single invoice. Now, the invoice ID is often the primary key, so it should always be used as a unique identifier for a particular invoice. Now, again, let's go back to the example. So you have one invoice that you are reading. So you will use the get call, which will return you a specific invoice. Then you have post. So it is not a method not allowed, because invoices itself you are able to create new invoice, right? So you are not allowed to do this, because this is created by the data store. Often people use the database sequencing, or let's say they might be using some other identity key to generate this. So you don't have this yet. So this particular invoice ID may not exist. So what will you create out here, right? So that is why invoices post will do the job for you. But for getting, for updating, and for deleting, this particular ID is useful, which is the path parameter or URI parameter. confirming the invoice ID that you are trying to do the operation with. So you can put, you can update, maybe you can also use patch to update a specific resource, and then finally delete. So you want to delete a particular invoice. So you can use this particular, you know, this is your API URL followed by the invoice ID, which will delete it. So again, all the action should be the verbs, the HTTP verbs, and the noun should be the resource. So invoices is the noun, right? So what about the state changes, right? Which APIs or which HTTP verbs should you be using? Now, post, delete, or put instead of get to alter the state. So you shouldn't use get to alter any state. Like for example, I want to activate an order, right? So I can definitely, I mean, I can always create a get API call, right? It might do the job in terms of the implementation. I can handle this part in the implementation, that whenever this particular API is triggered, I will activate the orders. But that is not a good practice. So get is often meant for getting a resource, right? So you, as I mentioned in the previous slide, so get is often meant for getting a resource. So you can use post API to activate, or maybe a patch API or put API to activate that order. So that way the contract remains clearly defined, that get will always give you some response of the current state, and it will not alter the state of that particular object. But post, put can, and delete, these can alter the state. Delete will delete it, post will create or update, and put will post will create and put will create or update. So that way you are updating the state of the resource, but get will not update the state of resource. It will always fetch the current state of the resource. What about filtering, sorting functionalities? So it is often recommended that you always add the filtering and sorting functionalities to your APIs, because you never know what your client wants, right? At any point of time, there might be a requirement that let's take this for an example, that I want to get all the invoices for a company named XYZ. So I can pass that company name out here as a query parameter. So that does the filtering job for me. Now I can go even more deep, like I can say that I want all the invoices for a company XYZ whose status is active. Now I am doing a more predefined or a advanced level search out here. So all these query parameters that I pass is kind of give you a limited response back, and that does the searching or the filtering capability. Now you can also use sorting, like let's say I want to sort on the basis of the employee number, let's say. So I have an employees API, and I want to get back the responses in a sorted order on the basis of employee ID. So I can also pass them in the query parameters, like sort equals to, often people use plus for maybe ascending, and negative minus for descending sorts. So it's upon you, but you can pass those details so that your server is capable to handle all this. And if there is a requirement from the client, in whatever status or whatever the reason might be, you can handle that API call and give back the resource or the response in a proper state. So this accounts for the filtering, searching, and the sorting capability. So query parameters is often useful in this particular situation. What about documentation? This is really important. Documentation, I mean, you did a lot of hard work, but then your documentation is poor. It will hardly be of any use to your client, right? Your client won't be able to understand like what needs to be done with that particular API. You might have created a very good API which does a lot of good work, and it's kind of really helpful. But then your documentation is so poor that the client who are trying to consume the API don't even understand what needs to be done. So that is really not helping, right? So you need to have a proper documentation which should be in place, and it should actually project what you are trying to do with that API, or what you are trying to give away as a part of the API. So firstly, from the documentation point of view, the accessibility. So it should be readily accessible, and it should be in a particular location. Next is the responses and requests. So you should provide the proper responses and the proper requests that must be used and it can additionally be having some SDKs for various popular programming languages. Like let's say JavaScript is very popular in terms of consumer because browsers are often using your APIs. Now this thing comes out of the box when you are doing the RAML designing. So the RAML takes care of the documentation. If you have a proper RAML or OS specification in place, which is currently doing the job for you. So your documentation is somewhat done, but still you can add a lot of other things. Like you can add notebooks, you can have proper documentation done in Exchange. Notebooks are really helpful that users can see that whole API interacting, and then in the Exchange you can have proper documentation done. So these things really help. Also, examples are really important. Now, if you are showing the proper example, let's say for 200 uh, you know response code, what is the example that I'm expecting from a particular resource? Let's say it is a list of employees, and then for the post I'm expecting like status success and some message, let's say the employee is created, something like that, right? So those examples are really helpful. uh, so it is useful not just for the end users, it is also useful for the developers when they are developing based on the contracts or the RAML specs or the OS specs. So documentation is really important, not just for your end users, but also for the people who are implementing your API. So really thumbs up for documentation. It's really important. What about versioning? So versioning is also important, right? So let's say that you have created an API which is doing the job, but then later you found that I need to change some data types, or I need to change the response codes, or let's say I need to change the format of the response. Like I added more hierarchy to the JSON object, stuff like that, right? So those are often referred to as a breaking change, because let's say you have already created an API which is in production, and some user is already using it. They have their automation done, or they have their websites created, or whatever the case is, and they are already consuming that API, and suddenly if you make an update to the same API, it will be a breaking change to them, right? Their code will no longer work. So it will have major implications. Now, what is a better way of doing it? You can have versioning done, right? You can version your API such that version 1.0, version 2.0, or version 1.1, whatever the case is. So you can have your versioning done, and you expose a particular version to a particular client, and then it is upon client when they are ready to absorb the version 2 of the API. So that way you don't add any breaking changes into your API, such that your client will still be using the previous version, but whenever they are ready and whenever they have their development done or changes done, they can move to the newer version of the API. Now that handles the breaking changes of it. But what about non-breaking changes? Like let's say I added a new endpoint, right? Or I added a new response parameter or stuff like that. So it's not a major change, right? So do I really need to maintain a versioning? It is often a best practice to do so, because you from the SEMVer principles or semantic versioning principles, you have a major minor versioning, right? So you can always refer to the minor versioning wherever you made some minor changes as well. So that keeps everybody in sync that there were some changes that happened, not necessarily a breaking change, but there were certain changes that happened, right? Now, what about versioning? Where should you keep the versioning? There are multiple ways that you can do it. Uh, Versioning is often used in the URI param, like let's say v1 slash employees, right? And then you have get, post, put, whatever. There is often some people who follow stuffs like adding the version in the query parameter, like they passed employees get, and in the query parameter version is equals to 1.0. That is also possible. Few people also use headers, like in the headers they will pass that the version is equals to 1.0, so the response will be from that particular version. But from the principle, like the visibility point of view, versioning your API in the URI based versioning, or adding it in the URL, like for example this particular one where I am saying API slash v1.0. So it adds the visibility to the end users. They are aware that they are using the version 1.0 or 1.0, and there is a possibility that there might be new versions coming, or they might have to update or stuff like that. So from the visibility perspective, the URI versioning is really good. You can always use the query param or header based versioning. That is fine, but it has some limited visibility or the understanding, right? Because as we said that filtering capabilities and the searching capabilities are often used in the query param perspective. So URI versioning is the go-to often. So we can always consider URI versioning as the best practice from versioning point of view.
Also, like Tirth, we can also add like versioning also can be done as a query parameter. It can be also done in a header, or
Right,
like it can be also done with a content type header also basically. So that are the possible ways. But as Tirth rightly said, like doing the versioning in the URI path, it's one of the best way. So because it's a transparent to any client who are consuming the API, and they are aware like what kind of API or what version of API they are consuming. Yeah.
right. The visibility is really important from not just from the developer or the information provider perspective, but also from the information user. So yeah. What about the status codes? I know that there is a list of status codes that we have in the W3 org or maybe the Mozilla websites, but we often tend to use few of these which are very often used. So let's go through them. So the first is the 200 or the 2x status codes. So it is often referred to as the success status code, and it is returned whenever there is a successful get or a delete operation. People often use 204, like let's say that the delete operation doesn't return anything, or I don't want to return any message, like let's say status success and message deletion successful or something like that. So 204 is often used with delete, but 20 or the 200, everything which has to do with 2xx is often referred to as a success status code. So 200 in this case is like you are successfully returning the get response or doing a delete operation, stuff like that. Put or post are often, I mean, yeah, people do use it, but usually it is best practice to use 201 or the created status for post. But let's say that you have an API where you are creating a pseudo get, like let's say the number of filters that you are providing is really huge, and we have a limit on on the get URL or the query parameters. So let's say, so that way you can pass those resources as a point of JSON object. Like let's say I want to fetch the employee with employee name this, having some values, like let's say having a employee ID within the range 1 to 100, things like that. So where we have a multiple filtering capabilities that needs to be added, and we end up creating a post API which is acting as a get. So that is also possible. So but the point is 200, okay, is like your request is successful at the server side, and it will be returning you whatever you are intended to return. So that's 200. What about 201? So 201 is often as referred to as successful creation. So with the post request, you are actually creating a resource in the data store. So 201 confirms that yes, a successful creation has been done, and that resource is added onto the data store. What about 3xx or the 3 region? It is like the redirection. So the first one is 301. So it is a permanent redirection. Like let's say there is a website xyz.com, and they change their domain to something else, or they have a new company which is there, let's say abc.com, and they want all the users who are going to xyz.com to be redirected to abc.com, because now that is their new address, let's say. So that way, you make sure that you are passing a 301, so that whenever the user is going to xyz.com, it gets back a response of 301 with the new URL or the new given URI, and the client automatically redirects you to that particular location. So that is 301. What is 302? Now 302 and 301 are almost similar in the way it function, but 302 is more of a temporary, redirection. Like let's say that it is redirected to abc.com for a very limited point of time, or for a very limited time. So for that particular time, the server will be giving you a 302 with that given URI. But after that, it might redirect to something else, or it can redirect to the original URL as well. So from that perspective, it's like 301 is a permanent one, and 302 is more of a temporary one. Now, what about 304? So it is like a non-modified or not modified status. So it is indicating that the requested resource did not modify since the previous transmission. So, like, let's say that the previous transmission that you did, it didn't modify the resource. So the next time you call it, it is still remaining the same. Really, not that much of a use, but uh, you know, still good to know. I mean, 304 is not modified, but 301 and 302 is really useful. It's sometimes used. 302 is often used in your JOT or the JWT tokenization, where you pass the auth code, and based on the auth code you redirect. You have the redirect URI. So SaaS-based applications use this 302 a lot because they have this tenant ID or the tenancy concept. So they can redirect each client to a particular tenant. So 302 is often useful there. Uh, so that's it from the 300 point of view. What about the 4x or the 400? So first one is the bad request 400, often very popular, right? So it's like somebody at some point of time will use your API and often pass this invalid syntaxes, and it will fail. So whenever the server is not able to process because of invalid syntaxes, or it doesn't comply with the contract that you created, it gives back a 400 request or 400 bad error. So an example can be like you are expecting a JSON object, but it is malformed. Like, let's say the quotes are missing or the commas are missing, something like that. So it's one example. So second is like you are expecting a number, but you are passing a string, or you are expecting string and you are passing number, something like that. So those are all part of bad request. Now, what about 401? So it is like unauthorized. So authentication is unsuccessful while accessing the API. So let's say that you haven't passed the credentials that are needed for accessing that API. So then you will get 401 unauthorized. Now 400 forbidden is when you are passing the actual authentication information, but you are not authorized to do that work. So let's say you are passing the client ID and client secret which you have created in your API management, and it's kind of giving an access to a particular API. Now, when you are passing that client ID and client secret, although it is a valid one, but you didn't request for the production API, but you requested for a dev API, and you are trying to access a production one. So obviously you don't have access to it, right? So that is where, although you are passing the correct details, but still you are forbidden. So uh, you know that's what it comes down to. The next one is 405 not allowed. So let me go back to one of the previous slides. So you might have seen this one, right? So when you are trying to do a post on something like this, you get a method not allowed or 405 not allowed.
Yeah, so there's some correction. So like 405 method not allowed. That's fine. So this 404 be then it's 403. Okay, so this it's some typo mistakes.
Oh, sorry,
Yeah.
sorry, sorry. Yep. 403 forbidden, right? 400 is already a bad request. Sorry about it. Yep. So yeah. So continuing with 405. So as I said, like if the user is trying to violate any API contract, then you will be getting a like 405 not allowed. Now next comes the 5xx errors, which is like the server error. So whenever you are trying to access a particular API, and it is not able to handle that request for some reason, it often gives out a server error. So it can be an internal server error, or maybe let's say that you are talking to some other resources, and that is failing, something like that. So those are all server errors. So everything is fine. I mean, all the details that you passed are okay. There is no bad syntaxes or anything, and everything is good. But then the server is not able to handle the request because of some issue. Let's say the worker restarted, or you know the API is down, in terms the infra is down. So anything can happen, right? So all those things comes under the server error, which is of the 5x origin. Caching is one of the other important thing. Caching is kind of something which makes your API effective, and it speeds up your APIs, or it makes your resource more useful. Now, caching static data is fine. Let's say you have a lookup table where it says that one will be mapped to ONE or two will be mapped to two, something like that, or any lookup data kind of a thing which is static. Caching them is fine because you can always expect the same result. But when it is dynamic, right? When the API is dynamic in nature, or the data is dynamic in nature, which changes frequently, caching them becomes very tedious because you might be giving your end users wrong data at any particular point of time, right? So that way, we need to be a bit more careful when we are caching dynamic data. Maybe let's say one example can be you have a paginated API, and you are trying to save the number of pages that you are trying to that a particular query gives you. Now you can save that dynamic data for, let's say, 5 or 10 minutes, or maybe 5 minutes, for example, or 30 seconds, whatever the case is. But you know that there is a lot of activity going on in that table, and it frequently changes. So increasing that timeout will definitely make your API give wrong data to your end users. So whenever it comes down to dynamic data, we have to be a bit more careful on how we cache them. But static data is fine. I mean, you can cache them for some longer time, but still it should have some cache invalidation policy based on which the caching should no longer work. Now, in terms of MuleSoft, you have caching that can be done in multiple fronts. You can do that in the API manager, adding the caching policy, which makes your whole API cacheable. And next is adding the cache scope in the implementation itself. So, based on the static and the dynamic nature of your data, you can take the call where you want to cache. But cache definitely boosts your performance of the API. So let's say you have another relation between the APIs. Right? Let's say this particular one, you have invoices and you want to get a particular line or fetch particular invoice line from an invoice. So you can use sub resource for this kind of a relationship. So you are passing. So this particular one is a really good example because you are following a lot of best practices. You have your the versioning done, so it is visible that you are trying to access version 1.0. You have your noun out here, which is invoices, and then you have the invoice ID, which is like passing the path param or the URI param, which shows that I want to access a particular invoice, and then followed by lines, which is the sub resource that I want to get all the lines for this invoice ID. So this is kind of a relationship that we are trying to access. Now let's go a bit more further. Like in that line, let's say I have multiple lines in that invoice, but I want to fetch only a particular or a single line. So I can even pass the line number out here, right? So lines and then the path parameter line number. Again, the same concept with creating. Now, again, I'm not passing line number here, as you can see in this post call. It dates back to the same example we saw earlier, where it would be giving a 405. But whenever I am creating another invoice line, I am passing the invoice ID and then lines, which is again a plural. So look at this example. It is following a lot of best practices here, using plural, using uh, proper name or the noun, and then it is also using the method or the HTTP verb to give it the action. So this is how we can do a relationship, or use sub resource for the relations point of view. So create invoice line already covered. So URIs, right? So taxonomy is really important. URI taxonomy is really important to keep your APIs, functional and consistent throughout your enterprise. Now, a good UI taxonomy helps you to categorize your APIs across functional domains. So it comes back from the domain-driven design, or it's really useful. Let's say somebody is working on the insurance domain, or from the banking domain. So using those best practices from the business point of view gives a good visibility to your whole API, because it kinds of useful to the business point of view, because they will be able to correlate like invoices, orders, right, employees, so all these things. So you can have a good taxonomy which can be created, and it can be like more of a governing principle when it comes down to the API structure, and it will make sure that it is, if the, let's say there are 4 to 5 teams who are working on different APIs, and you have a good URI taxonomy created, then it will make sure that all the teams are consistent with whatever they create. So, let's say my team comes up with invoices, but somebody else's team is creating create employees, the previous example that we saw. So it's not good, right? It's not consistent across the enterprise. So having a good taxonomy will definitely help you in the longer run to create a more generic or predefined URI or a API interfaces. So let's go through all this taxonomy details. So you have the part domain, right? So domain is usually the example of the domain name, like api.dev.example.com is one example. You can have api dot whatever domain. Now dev is added here because it makes sure that you are accessing the dev resource. Same goes for QA UAT. For the production, you might be using api.example.com, right? So that is the domain of the enterprise. Next is the application. So it is the name of the application. So for example, this is a logger, or it can be invoices or orders API or anything like that. So that confirms your app name. Next is the version which we already talked, that will be part of the URI or the path param. So version 1.0, version 2.0 or 2.1, whatever the case is. So you are passing that version information. Next is the resources. So let's say within the orders in API, I am trying to access the invoices. So that becomes my resource. Then the resource ID. Like, let's say I want to fetch the invoice with the invoice number 12345. So this becomes my resource ID. Next is the sub resource, which we already talked a few minutes back. Within that, resource ID 12345, I want to fetch all the invoice lines. So I can use lines. So maybe we'll be using lines here, not invoice lines, because if it is having already the parent resource, then using a sub resource with the relationship will be better. Like lines will be an example. Then the sub resource ID. So within that line, I want to fetch a particular line number. So that line number I am passing in. So that becomes my sub resource ID, and then followed by the query parameters, which will be used for all your filtering and searching point of view, right? So for example, this guy, I want to search the company with the company name XYZ, or let's say employee with employee name, whatever the case is. So all these are passed as a part of query parameters. So this makes sure that your API is always consistent across all the development effort or the API contract creation effort. So this, if we follow this, this will make sure that all the APIs that are created by no matter which team is always following the same standard. And standardization is really important in terms of the enterprise level, right? So the enterprise wants to keep the same standard for all the APIs, no matter which team is creating it. So that's it from my side. So if we have any questions, then we can take it, or else I'll pass it on to Jackie to go on with the RAML best practices.
Yeah. What is yeah? So thanks, Tirth, for the great session. So so whatever you have discussed, it is very useful to implement the best practices when we are designing or when we are writing the APIs. So it's very important. So thanks, Tirth, for this great session. So we have few questions like Tirth, recommendation with respect to RAML for ETL integration. I don't think general like Ramesh, we generally write ML for ETL integration. Generally, we don't do that. In ETL, like there might be possibility we may have a system API, we may calling the system API, so that via through HTTP link, right? So for that we can have a RAML, but I don't think we write any ETL for batch kind of integration. No, so we cannot do that basically. See, for ETL, why user want documentation? Why ETL want? Like ETL, the user is not going to consume your ETL jobs, right? Correct. If it's batch scheduler or something like that, if you are synchronizing the data between Salesforce and your database, right, the user will not trigger that particular ETL job, right? Right, it's not a REST service, Ramesh. You are right, Melvin. So in that case, you cannot define any RAML or any APIs for that, basically. In that case, if you really want to define some like APIs for your like for ETL job, so what you can do, so you can have a HTTP endpoint like for trigger the batch job, and for that HTTP endpoint you can write the REST or RAML, basically. So that is how you can do that.
Best practices point of view, it will be like how you create the the system in way that the ETL will integrate with. So that is something that we can concentrate on. Like, let's say, as Jackie mentioned, that we are moving data, let's say, from Oracle to Salesforce. Now, the oracles might have particular domain-driven tables, right? So you might want to create a particular API in that sense, which can be extended not just to that ETL but also to other integrations, which will make sure that you are following the best practices, right?
Kishore, like headers are always case sensitive. Okay, so headers are definitely, you call one API to other, the headers are case sensitive. You have to be take care about that. It's a case sensitive. No, no, like for ETL, like you cannot generate any automated or any RAML based or any Swagger based documentation. I don't think it's possible for now, basically. Like you cannot do that. The best way, like I don't think why we require the documentation for ETL. Like generally, like nobody will go come and like consume your ETL batch job, basically, right? It's a scheduler where you have already defined your rules and protocols, like what, like how we will synchronize the data between two systems, or like how will we fetch the data from one system and we will send to other system. Like in that case, like you don't have any consumer, so why we need a documentation for that, right? Tirth?
Right.
Okay, so let me quickly move ahead. So also, like somebody asked me, yeah, headers are case sensitive, basically. So we will talk about RAML best practices. Just let me know once you can see my screen. Okay. So what is a RAML? So like everybody knows, like RAML is nothing. It's a REST API modeling language. It's a language basically is used to design your APIs, basically. So generally we talk about design first approach in MuleSoft, or like in this APIs world, right? Generally we first design the API and later we define the implementation for those APIs, basically, right? So RAML is the language, or it's a modeling language where you can design your API and manage the full life cycle, or manage the full API life cycle, basically, or this API design life cycle, basically. So basically what you can do, you can design your API in using RAML, then you can test them, and also you can expose those APIs like to the user for getting the feedback. So sometimes what happens, like the business users also, or like maybe some architects, enterprise architect, or maybe some other users may want to see a RAML, or may want to see how the APIs will look like, right? So like before we do the actual implementation, so that is the way. So we can make use of the RAML. So like we can like we can use the RAML, and we can share the documentation, API documentation, or no API documentation using RAML, like API documentation. So any user, or any like any third party consumer, or any business end user can see your API, and like if they need any changes, like they require some extra APIs or extra fields, they want to change, want to do the changes in response. So that can be done at a design level. So let's consider a scenario like we have done the, like we have directly start with implementation, right? So in that case, what will happen, like if some changes come, like we have to do lot of changes here and there, like so generally RAML is the one of the best thing, like where we design the RAML, we just share that RAML with different users. They can go through the RAML, like if they can, and also they can provide the feedback basically. Okay, and generally RAML like API in a human readable format, and it's in the plain text basically. So if you see, like whenever you write a RAML code, right, it's very simple, like it's in plain text, and also it automatically generate a documentation, a API specification for you basically, right? So that is all about RAML. So generally, let we talk about the RAML best practices. So generally, like so I will not going to discuss like how we write resource type or how we write. We will talk about the best practices here. A RAML file name, a root file name must be in lowercase, and it must be alphanumeric character using the kebab case. So you can use the hyphen separated. So these are the some example where like you can use acme hyphen banking hyphen API. You can use account example dot RAML. It must be in the small letter, like you can use the hyphen between, for separation you can use the hyphen. Let me show that. So this is my API designer. If you see, this is my root file. So like I have OB accounts API. So like this is how I can use the naming convention, where like everything is in the small letter and it's a hyphen separated practices. When you are writing the RAML, everything should be in lowercase alphanumeric characters using the hyphen separated or kebab case basically. Second, a RAML header. So generally, when you talk about the RAML header, we have a titles, we have a version, we have a protocol. So for better documentation, like generally, like when you write, I mentioned, so RAML, what RAML do? So when you write a RAML, it generates the API specification documentation. So generally, it is best practices to provide like as much information as you can in your RAML. So basically, you have to provide the API title, you have to provide the version of your API, and you have to provide the protocol. So what are the protocols supported by my APIs, like what is the version of my APIs, and what is the like title. So those kind of things you can provide in the RAML header. So title is nothing, it's a plain text, and version, like each API should have a corresponding alphanumeric version. And in protocol, either you can define like what kind of protocol support, it support HTTP or HTTPS or both. So those kind of things can be defined in the protocols. Let me show that also. So here you can see this is my title. So instead of like I can define, I can change this name. So like so you can like this, you can provide the title basically. Okay, then you can provide the version. Also you can provide a protocol. So what are the different protocols supported? So it will add everything in the RAML into your ML. So what is your API title, so those kind of things. Let me refresh it. So what happens, so as much information you can add in a RAML, so it will generate a rich API specification, a rich API documentation basically. So okay, so I can say OB, or I can say open banking accounts API. So you can see, so basically, you can see the API title, version, and the supported protocols into your RAML documentation, right? So it's very important. You need to provide more information, so it will generate a rich API specification, basically. Okay. Then I come to media type. So generally, like what we do, like generally we define a media type at a resource level, right? So generally, like if I have a get method, like list all the accounts basically, I can have a post method, I can have a put method. So I define the media type at a resource level. But also there is a possibility you can define the media type at a root level basically. So once you apply a media type at a root level, so it will be automatically applied to all the below, all the resources you have defined in that particular RAML file. So if media type is set at a root level, the media type within each body definition does not need to be specified basically. Okay, so generally when you define a media type at a root level, it will automatically applicable to all the resources or to all the methods in that particular RAML basically. So that is how you can define a media type. So you can see this is the media type. You can define multiple media type. So I can say application slash JSON, I can say application slash XML basically. In case like you may have a resources where like you may have to define, like some resources support XML, some resources support JSON, then in that case you can define at a resource level. So it will override the root level media type basically. Okay, let me go to next slide. So RAML data type. So we what is the RAML data type? So generally, the RAML data type is one of the very powerful way of describing the information utilized within the API. So basically, what does this mean? So basically, each request have some format, like each request and response have some format, like it have a fields, like each fields have some kind of data types, right? So if you want to ensure that like whenever I get a request, like it should match with like proper data type, like whether required field is available or not, whether the required like email id is in the correct patterns or not. In that case, you can define a RAML data type. So RAML data type basically add the rules for validating the data against your type declaration. So let's consider. So like I have customer. In customer, I can have a customer ID, first name, last name. I can have an email. Customer ID is a mandatory field. The first name is optional. The last name is optional. The email ID is optional, but it have some pattern. So let's consider whenever the request will come, so it will validate all the types, all the data types, all the pattern, whether its required field is available or not. If anything goes wrong, so it will be rejected at a router level only. The request will not hit to the API also. It will rejected at a API kit layer itself, right? No, at a RAML level itself, basically. Okay. So for like you can define the data types, and like for adding the data types into your main RAML, so you can use particular syntax types, so you can define the alias, and you can include the data type like dot customer dot RAML. Let me show that. So basically, like I have this particular data type customers dot RAML. So where I've defined these are the fields for my particular customer API. And like if I want to use this, so I can use like something called, so you can make use of something called like, types. Then you can say customer type. Then you can include this, include. Then you can say data types slash customer. So that is how you can include this. So like you define, and like if you want to use for any of the field, so you can simply say, so like you can use the type and like use that particular alias what we have given here, basically. Okay. So that is so like anybody, any question? So I will come on that, Dhananjay, resource type and all those things. Okay. So come on that. Before that, any question on we can add at the end of HTTP method in the resource type? Can you, Raghav, can you more clear on this? Like, okay. So let me go ahead. Like I will take the question later. So so data type is clear, right? So instead of giving the examples, like we can define the data types, basically, because the problem with example, it will not validate the what type of data is coming into your input request, right? Whereas like whatever you are defining, the instead of example, you can define the data types. So data type will ensure like it will validate the like data against the type declaration, against what different patterns we have given. So those kind of things will be validated using the data type, basically. Okay. Let me take the next slide. So RAML resource type. So basically, what is a resource type? So resource type, basically it's a very powerful way of to reuse the pattern across the multiple resources and the methods. So basically what happens, if you see in your RAML, you most of the time, like you write the method get, you write the method post, and get method have some like some kind, like you define like what is the response type, what is the examples, what is the media type, right? For post, you define the request body, response body, right? So like if you have a multiple post, right, your skeleton remains same, only the change examples or request response body got changed, right? So like, but you are writing lot of duplication of code, basically, right? So here the resource type come into picture, so where you can write a pattern, so those patterns can be reused in your get or the post method, basically. Okay. So one of the advantage of the resource type, like it reduce the code, basically. So it make the code shorter. Apart from that, like it the code become more human readable. So like it improve the readability of your code, basically. But resource type is the optional component, so but it is recommended to use the resource type as I mentioned, it reduces lot of code, lot of efforts. You have to write the resource type once, and you can use that resource type across the multiple resources in your main RAML basically. So let me show the resource type, how we can make use of the resource type. So generally, I write one library. Under that, I have a banking resource. So under banking resource, so I have a get and I have a post method. So most of the APIs I have, like most of the APIs endpoint I have written in the RAML having get and the post method. So what I've done, so I've defined get and the post method. So in description, the resource path name can change, right? So for balance, the resource path will become balances. For account, the resource path will become accounts. So what I given, this is the keyword, a resource path name. So this will happen in case of balance, balance endpoint. This will say this API will fetch a balance detail. In case of accounts, it will say this API will fetch the account detail. Same thing goes with post. Then example can vary for each and every resources, so I defined this as a variable example reference one. Same thing goes with post method, where request body can change and response body can change. So I defined this as a variable example reference 2, example reference 3. Then later what I've done, so I have used the keyword uses. So when you define the resource type in the library, you use the keyword called uses. So I define one like alias, and then I use libraries slash where my resource type is available. Then what I have done, so I have this accounts method. In account methods, I have to pass three variable, right? For post, I have to pass three variable, example reference one. So generally, I'm passing like what is my example reference one. So read the JSON from here for example reference 2, then example reference 3. So for get method, it will use the example reference 1, so accounts.json. For post method, it will use the example reference 2 and example reference 3, because for post we pass the body and we get the response back, right? So that is how, if you see, this code has been reduced. If I keep on writing code for get and post every time, right, the code may goes very large, right? But here you can see I am just calling my resource type here basically. So it codes for you basically, right? You can see that it reduces a lot of codes. So I don't have to write a duplication of math like code again and again for get and the post basically, right? So you can simply use this particular code basically. Any question? So can we extend resource type in sense Ramesh, can you just s- can you be bit clear on this question, like can we extend resource type? What does this mean basically? Okay. So this is the resource type. Then later we come to threads. So threads is nothing, it's it's type of method. So like if you have some headers, like if you have some headers like transaction ID, or like you have some catch control header or some xyz header. So those headers you need to reuse across multiple resources or multiple APIs, right? In that case, you can define all those headers. Like instead of writing headers again and again for each and every resource or each and every methods, you can define those headers into your traits basically, and you can call that traits within into your main RAML. So let's consider I have an example. I have some errors basically. So I have some response code 400, 404, 405. Like I have to define the response, error response basically. So I will not go and use that error. I will not go and write the error response code for each and every method and each and every resources. Instead of that, I can define the uh, er- error codes into your threads, and I can use that threads into your main RAML. Let me show that example so it will better understand by you. So basically what happens, I have this particular traits. So basically I have threads. So basically I have error response threads. So if I don't write this into threads, so I have to define 400, 401, 404, 500 for each and every API or each and every method or each and every resources, right? So instead of that, I have defined that responses into my thread. Okay. Then if you see in my, so I use that particular threads declaration, use the alias, and I include that threads into RAML, and just I've used the is keyword to call that threads for the particular get method or the post method basically. So that is how you can make use of threads basically, right? So in that case, what will happen? I don't have to write a threads for each and the error response for each and every resources or HTTP methods, right? So if you see get, so in my get, if I say, so you can see 401, so everything is there basically, so all the response for all the APIs. So it's simplify your code, right? So it promoting the reusability, and it also promoting like it also ease the readability of your code basically. Okay, so where the thread is useful, so what is difference between resource types and the threads? So basically, like if you have a common headers or common query parameters or common responses like error responses, that you can define in the threads basically. But when you have a like a similar implementation for or similar code you are writing for get and the post method, like what is your request body, like what is your response body, like those kind of things. So those kind of things you can, or like similar patterns, right? Or similar like for get and post method you have a similar patterns, right? So those patterns you can define in your resource type basically. That's the difference between a threads and the resource type. So like when to use a resource type. So when you want to define the pattern, like similar kind of patterns for all the methods, right? So that those can be keep in the resource type. And when you have a sub common headers or common query parameters or common variables or common error response, those can be like defined in the threads basically. That any question? So I will take all this question. So Phillips, like, is there like I have already answered your question. We use many media type declarator, but how to refer them? See, Hariharan, like once you don't have to refer it. Once you have see, I told you, as I mentioned, like once you have defined a media type at a root level, by default it will be applicable to all the resources. Correct? Okay, I will come to on that. So by default it will be applicable to all the resources. In case for one of the method you want different media type, or you just want one media type, right? Application slash JSON. So you can like, or like so basically you have defined the media type application slash JSON or application slash XML at a root level. But for one of the resource you want application slash CSV, right? So what you can do, you can define that particular media type in the response body as a application slash CSV, or like in the request body as application slash CSV. So it will override the root level media type basically. So exchange.json have a meta type, like your organization information, like your root file names and all those things. So those kind, and it is very important to have this kind of inform like exchange.json, otherwise it will not work. It is a mandatory file, you should have it. So let me open that. So it contains metadata, like so your name, your what is or your organization IDs and all those things basically. So it contain all this particular detail. So and like it's very important, and you should not modify this file particularly. So like sometime what happens, like if you want to upload your RAML to some any point exchange, right? So using any point CLI or your any point REST API. In that case, this exchange.json is very important. If that particular file is not available, it will not going to upload your JSON, or it will not going to upload your RAML into your any point exchange. Ramesh, like what you can do, so basically we have a concept called fragment basically. So basically you can define your resource type in the fragment which is outside your RAML, and that fragment can be reused across the multiple RAMLs basically. So that is how you can do that. Yes, can we use trade to use multiple API? So just now I have answered your question. So basically, you have a concept of fragments. In fragments, you like if like you have some headers and you have some query parameters, you have some error response, which may be applicable to n number of APIs. In that case, you can define the fragments, and the fragments support resource type, library, threads, security schemes, everything supported by fragments, and you can define everything in that particular fragment, and that fragments can be called across the multiple RAMLs. Is this answer your question, Sravan? Sravan, right? Yes, Melvin, like what happens? So generally, if you want to define a multiple data types, basically, right? So multiple data types. So difference between data type and if you want to define a multiple object and with data types, right? So like you have a customer object, you have account object, you have so in library you can define the multiple object with data types, but whereas in data type you can define a single object, basically, like customers. If you want to define the data type like for accounts, so you have to create a separate data type file. So that's the difference between library and your data type, basically. And library also support like resource type, everything, like let me go to next slide. So I come to security schemes. So basically, again, it's a very important, so basically, you can define your RAML, what kind of authentication mechanism used by your APIs. Like let's consider a client ID enforcement, like authorization header, or some other, like some custom authentication. So those kind of things can be handled in the security schemes, basically. So generally what happens, so let me give an example. Security schema will just validate whether the metadata is coming or not. Like let's consider, in my security schema I define I am expecting a client ID and the client secret in the header. You have defined those things by a security schemes, right? In case if those client ID and the client secret is not coming in the input request, those are missing, the RAML will itself throw the error, the client ID and the client secret is not present, some kind of that error. But it will not going to validate the data, it will not going to validate the client ID and client secret value. For that you have to apply a right policy or right authentication policy, basically, right? So that policy will actually validate a client ID and the client secret. It will just validate whether client ID and client secret is present in input request or not. Okay, so let me show that. So try to understand, you need to apply a policy for validating the actual client ID and the client secret values, basically. Okay, let me show the RAML. So for security schemes, so I've defined a custom security schemes. Basically, you can define type, and the custom security schemes start with X hyphen whatever name you have to give. Then I told like I have a header, I require a client ID and the client secret. In case if something goes wrong, you can say like 401 unauthorized, basically. So this is the security schemes I've defined. And what I've done, so I've used a node called security schemes. Then I use the alias. Then I use the include. So you need to include security schemes, like just I'm saying like my file is located at this particular and my security schemes is located at this particular place. Now you want to apply security schemes for all the API, just you can use the secured by and use this custom security schemes, basically. If I see get method, so in get method, you can see a security parameters where you can see a client ID and the client secret, right? But there might be possibility you may not have to apply for each and every resources the same security scheme. The security schemes may be differ for each and every resources. So don't define a secure by at a root level. Instead of that, you can define a secure by at a resource level. So that is what you can do. Okay, any question? Let me check. Yeah, let me go with next slide. So now this is very important slide. So generally how the things should look, so basically API definition, this is nothing, this is your root file. Then threads, generally you have to group everything, like keep all the threads, you create one folder called threads, keep all the like all the files that is of extension into threads folder. The suffix will .raml, like cacheable.raml. Resource type, all the resource type must be in the resource type folder. All the security schemes must be in the security type like folder. Data types in the data types. Documentation in documentation. Examples in the example folders. Let me show that. And it's showing like what kind of extension it can have. For example, it can have .raml, json.xml. For documentation.raml, data types can be our raml schema.json and all. For security schema, it's .raml. Resource type for raml, like thread for .raml and API definition .raml. So let me show that structure. So always follow a correct structure. So if you see, I have data types. So all my data types are under the data types folder. All my examples, like error examples, everything is under my examples. Libraries are under my libraries folder. Security schemes under my security schemes folder. Traits under my traits folders. Like, all the traits will be under traits folder. And like OB account, this is my root file. This is always at a root level only. If you try to put this file into the any folder, it will give error basically. So you have to keep it here. This both file must be present here only basically. Okay. So this is the best practice. You create a folder, group group all the ramls according to your, like according to what type of raml you are using. Either it's a data type, or either it's an extension, either it's a security schemes, what, like, those kind of things. Let me go to next slide. So generally, it is always good practice to define the proper error message. So generally, this is like, you should have a name, like name of API which is returning the response, then what is the HTTP status code, then you should have a title, like, so generally title, like whether like title in the sense like internal server error, or like something like, so you can define like internal server error, unauthorized, those kind of title basic. Then you can, if you have a link, like, so you can provide the link also, but that can be optional. It is always good practice, if you are using the transaction ID with your API, you always send the transaction ID back to that. It is very useful for tracking purpose. So if you want to track, like, which of my response got failed, so transaction ID is very important. Then you can give a detailed description about the error, then when the error has came, so those kind of things can be sent into your error message. Yeah. So that is all about, so RAML best practices. One thing I will add more. So fragments. So I haven't written anything on the fragment, but let me discuss on that. So generally, let me go to my design center. So generally, you can define a fragment outside your RAML. Okay. So if you say create new project, you can say new fragment. So fragment, like you can define the fragment of type threads, resource type library, data type, documentation, example, annotation type, security scheme. So those are the things you can define. So what is the advantage of fragment? One of the thing, like you can publish your fragments to any point exchange. You can keep the versioning. You can version the fragments, like, API fragments. Main advantage, like whatever threats, whatever security schemes, whatever resource type you are defining in the fragment, they can be reused across the multiple ramls basically. So that is the one of the advantage. Generally, like at each organization, like, so if you see, if you are writing the APIs for some of the organization, or for multiple organization, or like for, they may have like a requirement where they have to use some dedicated header for each and every request. Like you have a transactions ID, like you have a like x correlation ID, like you have a x IP forwarded, those kind of headers. So that is the standard, right? So those kind of headers you can define in the threads of API fragment, and that API fragments can be reused across the multiple APIs. The second thing, like at enterprise level, your error response remains same, like, your error codes and all, everything remains same, like for most of the time, right? At an enterprise level basically. So those error response can be again defined into the fragment as a threads or whatever. Now consider, like we have a get and post method. So for most of the APIs, the get and post method remains same, only the change request body and the response body and bit description. So those kind of resource type can be also defined in the fragments, and that can be reused across the multiple APIs. So yeah, so always try to use fragments as much as possible, so which will, see, I know, like resource type and threads are giving the reusability, but they, so generally what does do, they will provide the reusability for single API if you are defining the resource type and the threads in that particular raml. But when you are defining those resource type and the threads in the fragments, that can be reused across all the ramls basically. Okay. Yeah. So any further question? Yeah, Tirth, you are right. It is not always good. Like sometimes we need to mock, or we need to mock the actual system error. Generally, because sometimes system error may contain the server details and all those things. So we should avoid that basically. Let me take. Okay. So see, Pratik, I mentioned like data type, so it's almost for data basically you can define your see advantage with data type like in like so schema will also validate your data, right? So basically whatever schemes you are defining, it will validate data. But with the data type, like it's more flexible, where like if you want to do any changes or anything, so like I will like let's take the example. So generally, like you when you are talking like working with domain models basically, so when you are working with domain model basically, right? So there are some set of models, there are some set of apis which will be like those models will be reused across the multiple apis basically, right? So in that case what you can do, you can write a data types of fragments. So you can define your data type in the fragment, those domain models you can define in the fragments basically, and those data models like can be used across the multiple apis, whereas you cannot do those things with schemas basically. See Hariharan, like we have some like you can definitely use attribute dot headers, and like in square bracket you can pass x hyphen correlation hyphen id. Right now no, there's a Hirala, like we like I have some example I can give you later, like I have some content for that, so I can give you that later. Right now I don't haven't created the example for that. Okay. Anup, like I will say no. As a best practice, you should not do that. Yeah, you can definitely define your parameters into your threads, and then you can like call it in the security schema. So generally, because whatever you are defining into your security schema, that will be added to the security header by default. But that is not case in the threads basically, right? So I will not suggest you define the threads for this kind of thing. So like so like what will happen like simple like basically you need to write lot of codes also, like like you generally see Anup, you can do like that also. You create two headers, like you are expecting two header, client id and the client secret basically, right? So right, you even you are not writing the threads basically, even you're not writing the security schema, you can say that I want this two header, client id and the client secret, but still your raml will validate that. But in your documentation it will not say what is your security schemes basically for this particular api. So the see things can happen in any ways, but if you want to generate a rich documentation where it is saying each and everything, like if you see I take this post method, if you take this post method, in post this post method it showing one tab what is the security for this particular api, right? So so we can provide like more information like what are the security headers and those kind of things using the security schemes. Yeah, you can use Raghav JSON schema also, so no issue in that. You can make use of that. Okay, it's not deprecated, it's available, but nowadays people are using the data type, which is much better way, where you can define your bounded context model or domain model basically. Those kind of things can be easily defined. Okay, so guys, we can start if no question further. Yeah, I will share the raml also, so after end of this call I will share the raml as well as all the links to you basically. Yes, yes, Sumida, you can definitely use the mocking service after adding the schemes also. But you have to, as I mentioned, like that, like when you will be using the mocking data, it will just ensure that that's client ID and the client security is coming, but it will not validate the data. Okay, so you can definitely use that. You you don't have to touch that exchange the JSON. Okay, so it created by default when you are creating and when you are creating the raml when you are creating raml basically. Okay, you don't have to do that. You don't have to do that when you are creating the raml, it will automatically create it exchange.json. So you don't have to touch that also, like so like it just contain the metadata, some information, like but it that file is required for further, like publishing to any point exchange or for further use. That file is required. Okay. Okay, so let me Stop sharing. So, guy, if no further question, like so just I'll put. I will go with the first question. Yeah, you are right. So generally, see, if you have some like security schemes or threats or resource type which you need to reuse across the multiple RAML, in that case you can go with fragments basically, and those fragments can be called into your RAML basically. Okay, so let me start with the first question. So let me put the line now. Okay, so I hope everybody can see my screen. Okay, the first question is which RAML component is used to add the rules for validating the data against type declaration? A, security schemes, B, data type, C, resource type, D, threats. Uh, okay, so let me check. The answer is B, it's a data types. So let me put some first name. Guy, I'm sorry. Today, like we don't have that particular application enabled. So I will use the wheels name of wheels for today's session. Katra clips. So let me okay. So let me spin up now. Let's see who is the first winner. It's Philip Sharma. Philips, can you just ping me your email ID? Philips, can you give me your email ID quickly? So, guys, one more thing, like you will be receiving a mail after this session for feedback. Please provide the feedback, basically. Okay. I hope like everybody will provide the this session. So let me go with a second question. It's Philips. Stops. So I will just go with second question. I hope everybody is ready for second question. Okay. I hope everybody can see my screen. So let me go open the question. So which URL is correct with the API best practice for fetching all card details? So like get http api.example call slash api version 1.0 slash car, like uh, http slash api.api.api dot slash car. Then we have option C, get http api.example.com slash api version 1.0 slash cars. Then we have a post method with http api.example.com slash api slash version 1.0 slash cars. So we have a four option. So so which URL is correct with the API best practices for fetching all car details basically. Let me check. Okay, so I will put the line before, like I will give the answer is C. If you see in C, so as per API best practice, we should use the resource which should not be a singular and which must be a noun. So we have used car, we have a proper versioning, right? In this first URL we are not using, we are using the singular noun. In second we are using the singular noun. Okay, but in D we are using the not singular noun, but the method is post, so we are using the wrong method for fetching the card detail. So that's why it's the correct answer. So let me check how many gave a correct answer. It's Bal Mukund. Bal Mukund Parasar, Dipti Patal, Dipti, Kishore Katragad. Let me spin up the wheel. So it's a Bal Mukund Parasar. Can you give me your email ID? The second winner is Bal Mukund Parasar. Can you please give me your email ID? Okay. Let me go with third question. Just sharing my screen. Okay. So I hope everybody can see my screen. Let me open the question. Let's wait. Okay. So I'm just opening the question. So can get method alter or modify the resource? True or false? Okay. So the answer is B, I think, because the get cannot alter or modify the resource. Okay, the answer is false, which is B. So let me check the Aditya first.
So Jackie Kishore got his name in all the three rounds, right?
Yeah, Rutik Ambre, right? I took the right name, hopefully. Aditya, yeah. Hope. Yeah, Aditya, can you ping me your email ID? Aditya. Kishore, can you also just ping me your email ID also? Let's see, like, you gave all the three correct answers. So, but Sir, can you please ping me your email ID? Yeah. So guys, like hopefully, like, can everybody please on the camera? Like, I will just stop the recording.